In the year 49 of the Common Era, a boat came in from the sea, carrying a man who had been away for 8 years. The island of Corsica sits in the Tyrrhenian Sea, roughly 100 miles west of the Italian coast, near enough to be visible on a clear day from the higher elevations of the mainland, far enough that the crossing had weight. The man on the boat had made this crossing before, in the other direction, under different circumstances. When he had first traveled to Corsica, he had traveled as a prisoner, stripped of his position in the Roman Senate, stripped of his dignities, sent out by imperial decree to a rocky, wind-scoured island where the population was thin and the intellectual company thinner still. He had spent 8 years there. He had read and written and waited with the patience of a man who had studied patience, though studying a thing is never quite the same as having it. His name was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, and on the morning the boat came into harbor at the Italian coast, he was perhaps 53 years old, and he was not returning to poverty. This is where it is useful to let the picture settle for a moment before any argument is made. The light would have been morning light, Mediterranean and clear, the kind of light that finds the edges of things and makes them precise. The docks would have had the smell of rope and salt and the particular industry of a port in the middle of its working day. A man steps off a boat after 8 years of exile, and the first thing the ground does is hold him differently than the sea did, steadier, more insistent, the solid world asserting its claims. 8 years is a long time, long enough that the man stepping off the boat is not quite the same man who stepped onto the other boat in the other direction, under guard. He has written things, he has thought things through, he has had, in the involuntary simplicity of exile, an education in the gap between what he had believed about poverty and what it felt like to live close to it. And he is stepping off this boat into the prospect of enormous wealth. The recall had come through Agrippina, mother of the young Nero, who wanted Seneca as her son's tutor. Within a few years of his return, Seneca would be among the most powerful men in Rome, serving as an advisor to a young emperor, drawing on the resources of imperial proximity in ways that were efficient and, by Roman standards of the period, entirely customary. Property accumulated. Loans were made. Agricultural estates outside the city, in the region around Nomentum, became his working landscape, the places he would return to from the court, the places he would write from, the places where he kept bees and grew olives and composed, in the late afternoons, the essays and letters that would make his name last longer than the fortune did. By the mid-50s of the first century, Seneca's wealth was estimated, by those who counted such things, at something in the range of 300 million sesterces. The number requires some translation. A Roman legionary soldier in this period earned roughly 900 sesterces in a year. 300 million sesterces was, by this measure, a fortune equivalent to the annual wages of more than 300,000 soldiers. It was one of the largest private fortunes in the Roman world. The man who had written, from exile, about the indifference of fortune to genuine happiness had, upon his return from that same exile, built one of the most formidable financial structures that Rome had seen in a generation. He knew this. He wrote about it. He did not hide from the contradiction, or rather, he argued that what appeared to be a contradiction was not one, and the argument he made is worth following carefully, because it has more to it than the self-serving logic of a rich man explaining why his money does not count against his philosophy. The question, as Seneca understood it, was not whether wealth was good. The question was what kind of thing wealth was. Before Seneca was born, before the Roman Empire had taken its current form, a philosopher named Zeno had walked and taught in a painted porch in Athens, the Stoa Poikile. So named for the military scenes that covered its walls, images of battle and discipline, and the organized force of collective human purpose. Zeno had made a claim so radical that philosophers were still arguing about it 4 centuries later, and are arguing about it still. Virtue, he said, is the only genuine good, not health, not wealth, not beauty, nor reputation, nor long life, nor the pleasure of good company on a warm evening. Virtue alone, the perfected rational disposition of the soul, the complete alignment of a person's will with reason and nature, was the sufficient and necessary condition for a happy life. A person of complete virtue would be happy even in poverty, happy in exile, happy, under the extreme version of the claim, even while being tortured. This was the foundation on which Seneca built everything. But the foundation came with something else attached to it, something that made the whole structure considerably more habitable for a man of Seneca's temperament and circumstances. Because Zeno had also made room, careful philosophical room, for a category of things that were not genuinely good, but that were rationally worth preferring. Wealth belonged in this category. So did health, and physical comfort, and a good reputation, and all the other things that most people spend most of their lives pursuing. These were what the Stoics called proegmena, preferred indifference. Things worth selecting, all else being equal, because they support and facilitate a functioning human life. Things a reasonable person would choose over their absence, as a reasonable person would choose warmth over cold, as long as the choice was not made at the expense of virtue. The technical name for the entire category was a diaphora, indifference, things morally neutral in themselves, their value or disvalue deriving entirely from the use made of them. Seneca inherited this framework, worked within it, and put it to work in his own defense. The fortune was real, the philosophy was real. The defense was that these two realities did not conflict, because wealth was not the kind of thing that could conflict with virtue, not by its presence at any rate, only by its misuse, only by the confusion of the instrument with the purpose. It was a tidy argument. What is interesting is not that Seneca made it, but that he kept returning to it, testing it, turning it over in the essays and letters that still survive. A man who was entirely at peace with the arrangement would perhaps have made the argument once and moved on. Seneca made it repeatedly, from different angles, with different metaphors, as if the question kept coming back, which perhaps it did, from inside as much as from outside. From outside it came with some force. Around the year 58, a man named Publius Suilius Rufus stood in the Roman Senate and asked, publicly and by name, what philosophical school had produced a fortune of 300 million sesterces. The attack was documented and widely reported. Suilius was himself no model of philosophical virtue. He had accumulated his own wealth through methods considerably more obviously corrupt than Seneca's, but the charge he was making did not require a saint to make it. It required only the specific audacity of pointing at something that everyone in the chamber already knew, and naming it aloud in a context where naming it had consequences. What philosophical school, Suilius asked, had taught this? The question landed with a particular kind of weight. Not the weight of novelty, no one in that chamber was learning something new, but the weight of a truth that had been visible for years and had not, until that moment, been given a voice. The senators would have been an audience of men who were themselves embedded in webs of financial obligation, patronage, and material interest, and none of them could have entirely dismissed the charge, because none of them could have entirely dismissed the evidence. Seneca's answer, delivered not in the Senate, but in the Essay de Vita Beata, on the happy life, is careful and worth attending to. He does not deny the wealth. He argues that the accusation rests on a philosophical mistake. The assumption that the presence of wealth in a wise man's hands is the same kind of thing as the presence of wealth in an unwise man's hands. This is, he says, as mistaken as concluding that a sword in the hand of a skilled soldier and a sword in the hand of a man governed by rage are equally dangerous. The sword is the same. What differs is everything that determines its use. The image has a quiet elegance to it. A weapon is not good or bad in itself. Its character is determined by the steadiness of the hand that holds it and the judgment of the mind that directs that hand. A sword in a soldier's grip, under discipline in service of a legitimate purpose, is not the same moral object as a sword in the grip of a man who has lost his reason. Same metal, same edge, entirely different moral situation. Wealth, Seneca argued, is like this. In the hands of a person whose desire for it is uncontrolled, who pursues it at the expense of virtue, who fears its loss to the point of anxiety and grasping, who allows it to become the measure of everything else. Wealth is a source of corruption and suffering. In the hands of a person who has understood that it is preferred but not necessary, who holds it without fear because they have genuinely reckoned with its loss, who uses it for friendship and generosity and the kind of engaged civic life that philosophy recommends, rather than the kind of withdrawal from it that philosophy permits but does not celebrate. In those hands, wealth is an instrument, nothing more, nothing less. The argument is coherent. The question that sits alongside it, quiet and patient, is whether any real hand is ever quite as steady as the argument requires. In the same years that Seneca was making this argument in writing, his financial operations extended considerably beyond the Italian estates. In the provinces of Britain, recently added to Roman territory under the Emperor Claudius, Seneca had lent substantial sums of money. The historian Cassius Dio, writing more than a century later, records that Seneca had extended approximately 40 million sesterces in loans to the provincial population of Britain, and that when he called those loans in, abruptly, insistently, at interest, the economic disruption contributed to the conditions that preceded the revolt of Queen Boudica in approximately 60 CE. The revolt was not a minor disturbance. Boudica led the Iceni tribe in an uprising that destroyed the Roman colony at Camulodunum, sacked Londinium, and killed, by ancient estimates, tens of thousands of people before Roman legions suppressed it. The causes were multiple, and the historical record is partial. But Cassius Dio's account places the calling in of Seneca's loans among the contributing factors. History is rarely so conveniently arranged as to provide a single cause for a catastrophe, and it would be too simple to lay the Boudican revolt at Seneca's feet. But the image that emerges from the record, the philosopher who wrote about the indifference of fortune, whose agricultural estates stretched to the horizon in the Italian afternoon light, whose loans were called in from a provincial population, with the impersonal efficiency of a man managing a financial portfolio, this image does not entirely fit the portrait of the sage, holding wealth lightly in an open hand. Seneca would not have been unaware of the gap. The letters and essays are the work of a man with a fine mind and a reasonably honest conscience, and both of those qualities make the repeated return to the same defense legible as something other than complacency. He returned to it because it was not settled, not entirely, not in the way that a question fully resolved stays settled. The figure he cuts, sitting at his writing table in the house at Nomentum, as the afternoon light shifts across the agricultural land outside, is not the figure of a hypocrite who does not know he is a hypocrite. It is something more interesting and more humanly recognizable. It is the figure of a man who has understood something genuinely important, who has grasped with real philosophical precision the distinction between holding wealth and being held by it, and who is living in the gap between what he has understood and what he has fully achieved. This gap, in Stoic philosophical terms, had a name: the person who was not a sage, not the ideal sophos of complete and perfected virtue, but a genuine philosophical aspirant making real progress without having arrived, was a prokopton, a person in motion, moving toward the ideal without having reached it. This was not a euphemism or a consolation prize. It was a technical philosophical category that acknowledged something important about the nature of moral development: that progress and incompleteness can coexist, that a person can be genuinely better than they were without being everything that philosophy asks for. Seneca used this category for himself, explicitly, in his letters. He was not a sage. He did not claim to be a sage. He was a man who understood what a sage would do, and was doing his imperfect best to move in that direction. What made the Roman census record something more than a bureaucratic exercise was exactly this quality of philosophical seriousness. When an official wrote a number beside a man's name in the senatorial ledger, when the state declared, in the blunt numerical language of property qualification, what a man was worth, the act of writing was also, in some sense, a philosophical act. It placed a number on a life. It suggested that the number was a measure of something real. In Seneca's philosophy, whatever its tensions and difficulties, was precisely the project of insisting that the number measured nothing about what mattered most. The argument from De Vita Beata that Seneca kept returning to, that wealth in the hands of a wise man is an instrument rather than a master, has this quality about it: it is more a claim about the hands than about the wealth. The wealth is morally neutral. The hands are the question. The hands and the soul behind them, and the degree to which that soul has genuinely made peace with the possibility of losing everything the hands hold. In the Consolation to his mother Helvia, written from Corsica during the years of exile, Seneca had worked through the argument from the other side. He was poor, or close to it, by the standards of the life he had known. He was physically uncomfortable. He was politically humiliated. He was separated from everything that Roman society identified as the markers of a successful life. And yet he was arguing to his mother, who was grieving for him, and perhaps to himself as well, that none of these losses constituted the kind of loss that genuine philosophy required him to mourn. The argument was real. It was not performed. At the same time, it was being made by a man who had not chosen his poverty, who was writing in the hope of its ending, who was waiting with the patience he had studied for a recall that eventually came. There is something in the Helvia that has the quality of a philosophical exercise being conducted under actual conditions, the test of the idea against real circumstances, the essay both describing and performing the practice it recommends. The recall came. The boat came. The morning light on the Italian dock was what it was, clear and ordinary, and indifferent to the arguments that would occupy the man stepping onto it for the rest of his life. The years after the return were the years of the greatest wealth and the greatest exposure to the question. The estates outside Nomentum, the properties in Spain, the accounts in Britain, all of this was present and real and required managing. And alongside all of this, Seneca was writing. The essays were being composed. The letters were being collected and revised. The philosophy was not a retreat from the material circumstances, but a sustained engagement with them, an ongoing effort to understand what the correct relationship was between the life he was actually living and the life the philosophy described. De Vita Beata on the happy life was written around 58 CE at the height of Seneca's wealth and influence, in the same period that Suilius was making his Senate speech. The timing is not incidental. The essay reads, in part, like a response to the charge before the charge was fully made public, or to the version of the charge that Seneca had been making to himself for longer than Suilius had been making it to anyone else. In it, Seneca writes with unusual directness about the problem of practice and principle. He acknowledges that he does not live as his philosophy prescribes. He says this plainly, without evasion. The prescription is correct. His approximation of it is imperfect. The gap between the two is not a reason to abandon the prescription, and it is not a reason to pretend the gap does not exist. It is simply the condition of being a human being engaged honestly with a demanding set of ideas. The sword analogy is in this essay. The image of wealth as an instrument rather than a master is here. The argument that performing poverty, making a theatrical show of philosophical simplicity, is as philosophically naive as worshipping wealth, that the cynic who sleeps in a jar and the plutocrat who sleeps in a palace are both in different ways, organized around material things rather than around virtue. This is here too. What the essay produces across its full length is the picture of a man genuinely wrestling with a question rather than delivering a verdict. The voice is confident in the philosophical framework, but honest about the distance between the framework and the life. The confidence and the honesty coexist without resolving into either. The afternoon light outside the writing table at Nomentum would have been the particular gold of the Italian countryside in middle or late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look simultaneously old and newly precise. The agricultural estates would have been audible as well as visible, the distant movement of workers and animals, the particular silence of cultivated land under the sun. And in the room where the writing was happening, a man who had thought about wealth for 30 years, who had lost it and regained it, and acquired it on a scale he had not initially imagined, was writing a sentence. The sentence, documented, is this, that wealth in the hands of a wise man is a slave, and in the hands of a fool, a master. He wrote it, he sent it out into the world, and then he went on managing the estates, and composing the letters, and occupying the proximity to imperial power that made both the wealth and the philosophy simultaneously possible and mutually interrogating. The question the sentence leaves open is the same question that had been open since the boat came into harbor in 49 CE, the same question that would remain open across all the years of writing and managing and arguing that followed. The question is not about the sentence. The sentence is well constructed and philosophically sound within the framework it inhabits. The question is about the hand, not in the abstract, not in the theoretical construction of the Stoic sage, the sophos of perfected virtue, who can hold anything lightly because virtue has become his entire orientation. In the specific, documented, satirically embedded hand of a Roman philosopher-statesman who had 300 million sesterces and loans outstanding in Britain and agricultural estates outside the city, and a genuinely sophisticated understanding of why none of this, according to the philosophy he had spent his life elaborating, should define him. Whether any hand attached to any actual human being living an actual human life is ever quite as steady as the argument requires, this is the question that settles without urgency, without demand, at the edge of the picture. It does not require an answer tonight. It did not require an answer in 58 CE, when Seneca wrote the sentence down in the afternoon light. The sentence was written. The question was already older than the sentence, and would outlast it. The coin has two faces, both are real. Turning it in the dark, finding each one genuine, is perhaps where the thinking begins rather than where it ends. In the years just after 300 BCE, on the northern edge of the Athenian agora, there stood a long open colonnade whose inner walls were covered with painted battle scenes. The paintings showed the Greeks at Marathon, the fall of Troy, the contest at Oeno, military victories rendered in bright pigment on plaster, the kind of images a city puts on walls to remind itself what it is capable of. The covered walkway was called the Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, and most of the people who passed through it on any given morning were going somewhere else, using it as a shortcut, stepping briefly out of the sun. But there was a man who taught there, and what he was saying had almost nothing to do with military triumph. His name was Zeno of Citium, and he had come to Athens from Cyprus some years before, having survived a shipwreck that cost him the merchant cargo he had been transporting across the eastern Mediterranean. He was not Athenian by birth. He had arrived as an outsider, had found his way to philosophy through the bookshops and the schools, and had eventually begun teaching under those painted walls, not in a formal academy, not in a building with a name attached to a wealthy patron, but in a public walkway where anyone could stop and listen. And what he said in that space, against the backdrop of those painted soldiers and their painted victories, was that all of it, the battles won, the wealth accumulated, the political standing achieved, was not the source of what anyone actually wanted from a life. What a person actually wanted, Zeno said, was happiness, and happiness, genuine, stable, unconditional happiness, was available only through virtue, not through victory, not through property, not through the approval of other people or the security of a well-stocked treasury. Virtue alone was the necessary and sufficient condition for a happy life, which meant that a person of complete and genuine virtue would be fully happy even on the rack, even in exile, even in the grinding scarcity of poverty. The claim was extraordinary enough that some of his listeners stopped walking and stood still, and others kept returning, day after day, to hear him work through the implications. The school that formed around him took the name of the place where he taught. They were the people of the porch, the Stoics. The argument had a radical edge that it is easy to miss now, worn smooth by centuries of use. Zeno was not saying that wealth and comfort were bad. He was not saying that a virtuous person ought to seek poverty or welcome hardship as though suffering had its own philosophical merit. What he was saying was harder and stranger than either of those things. He was saying that wealth, health, political standing, physical beauty, the love of friends and family, all of the things that most of the people passing through the Stoa Poikile would have named without hesitation as the constituents of a good life, were, from the point of view of virtue and happiness, morally indifferent. Not bad, not good, indifferent, in the precise technical sense of mattering nothing to the fundamental question of whether a life was going well or badly in the way that actually counted. The Greek word the Stoics used for this category was adiaphora, things without a moral weight of their own, things that could be present or absent without changing the essential quality of the life being lived. Zeno and his successors were careful to say that this did not make these things meaningless or identical or unworthy of any preference at all. It made them a different kind of thing from virtue, useful, pleasant, worth pursuing through ordinary rational effort, but never to be confused with the source of what made a human life genuinely good. A person could reasonably prefer to have money rather than to lack it, to be healthy rather than sick, to live in a comfortable house rather than sleep in the street, and in preferring these things they were simply behaving like rational creatures who understood what supported human functioning. But that preference was of a fundamentally different order from the commitment to virtue, and confusing the two was the central error that most human unhappiness was built on. Chrysippus of Soli, who became the third head of the Stoic school after Zeno's death, and who was later credited with being in many ways the school's real systematic architect, had worked out the logic of this distinction with considerable precision. Among indifferent things, Chrysippus argued, some were rationally preferable, worth selecting, worth pursuing through normal effort, genuinely useful to a life of virtue, and some were rationally dispreferred. Health belonged to the first category.
Or poverty, sickness, exile.
These belonged to the second. Chrysippus gave a name to the preferred indifference, praeugmena, and in doing so, he gave the Stoic school something that Zeno's first stark formulation might have seemed to preclude: philosophical permission to participate in ordinary human life, to hold a job, to maintain a household, to pursue a reasonable degree of material stability, without any of this participation being a betrayal of the philosophical commitment that organized everything else. The permission was important because without it, the Stoic position risked sliding into something closer to the Cynics, the philosophical movement associated with Diogenes of Sinope, who had concluded that the only path to genuine freedom was the systematic stripping away of every external dependence, every social convention, every material comfort. Diogenes lived in a large storage jar in Corinth and owned almost nothing. That was not the Stoic answer. The Stoic answer was more nuanced, more inhabitable for people who were. The question was never whether the wealth was present, but whether the person holding it understood, at the level of genuine conviction rather than philosophical performance, that the wealth was not the thing their happiness depended on. It is easier to state that distinction than to make it real. Chrysippus understood this. He spent a great deal of philosophical effort working out what genuine psychological freedom from external goods actually looked like from the inside, as opposed to what it looked like when it was simply described from the outside as a principle. The key was that the preference for wealth over poverty, for progmen over progmen, must be held lightly, not desperately, not with the grip of someone who believes that losing the thing would be losing the ground under their feet. The Stoic relationship to preferred indifference was supposed to have a quality of easy open-handedness about it, the willingness to pursue these things through rational effort and to release them without anguish when circumstances required their release. What this required was not an act of will performed once and then secured, but a quality of character cultivated over a long period through sustained practice and sustained attention. The Stoics were not describing a decision that could be made in a philosophical moment and then taken as settled. They were describing a disposition, a stable, integrated way of being oriented toward external goods that had to be developed the way any deep quality of character is developed, slowly, imperfectly, through effort repeated in ordinary life over many years. And this is where the school's honest acknowledgement of its own difficulty becomes visible. Chrysippus himself had admitted that the figure of the Stoic sage, the sophos, the person of complete and perfected virtue, whose happiness was genuinely unconditional, was extraordinarily rare, not merely unusual, not merely difficult to find and practice, genuinely rare in a way that approached the theoretical. The sage, by the school's own accounting, might appear once in many centuries, if at all. Chrysippus is said to have remarked that a wise man was as rare as the Ethiopian phoenix, which was itself the kind of bird that appeared once in an age, and then only in the vicinity of the impossible. The standard was not being used as a rhetorical flourish. The Stoics took their own ideals seriously enough to notice that almost no one they could actually point to had reached it. This left the school in an interesting position. If the sage was the only person who had genuinely achieved the philosophical goal, and if sages were essentially non existent, then what was everyone else who was trying to live philosophically doing? The Stoics answered this question with a figure they called the prokopton, a word that translates roughly as the person making progress, the person on the way, the person whose moral development is real and directional, even though it has not arrived at its destination. The prokopton is not the sage. The prokopton may be far from the sage, but the prokopton is genuinely moving, has turned in the right direction, has understood something true about what virtue requires, is making the effort with some consistency, and this genuine movement is not nothing. It is, in fact, almost everything that philosophy in practice looks like in any life that takes it seriously. The distinction between the sage and the prokopton was not a concession or a lowering of standards. It was an honest description of the philosophical life as most people who try to live it actually experience it. The destination is real. The destination is worth moving toward. The distance from the destination does not make the movement meaningless. These three things were true simultaneously, and holding all three without collapsing into either perfectionist despair or complacent self-satisfaction was itself a kind of philosophical achievement. The Stoics had built into their school a way of thinking about moral imperfection that neither dismissed it nor made it into a catastrophe. Seneca knew this distinction well. He returned to it across his writing with a consistency that suggests it was not just a theoretical position for him, but something closer to an ongoing orientation toward his own life. In one of the late letters addressed to his friend Lucilius, who had asked him directly about the state of his own philosophical progress, Seneca wrote with a candor that is still striking across the distance of 2,000 years. He was not a wise man. He did not claim to be a wise man. Well, he did not expect at this point in his life to become one, but he was making genuine effort, he said, and the direction of the effort mattered. Moving toward virtue, even imperfectly, even haltingly, even with regular backsliding, was different from standing still, and standing still was different from turning away. The admission was not performed humility. In the context of Stoic philosophy, Seneca's self-identification as a prokopton was a precise and technically accurate claim, and making it honestly rather than claiming the philosophical status that his public reputation might have seemed to entitle him to was itself an act of philosophical seriousness. He had thought about what virtue actually required. He had looked at his own life with some honesty, and what he found there was not the sage, but the person in progress. Real progress, he believed, but progress that still had the quality of a journey rather than an arrival. He chose the honest description over the flattering one, and kept writing from that position, year after year. The question that runs through the philosophy, steady as a current beneath the surface of everything else, is what it actually means to prefer something without being governed by it. Epictetus with govern quality, for naivlestitting, who taught philosophy in Nicopolis in the early 2nd century CE, and whose lectures were recorded by his student Arrian, had organized almost his entire teaching around what he called the dichotomy between what is epiphyme, up to us, within our control, and what is uk epiphyme, not up to us, outside our control. The dichotomy was ancient by Epictetus's time, present in Stoic thinking from the beginning, but Epictetus had sharpened it to a point that could cut through any comfortable accommodation to fortune. What is up to us, Epictetus said, is the quality of our own judgment, our own desires, our own assessments of things. What is not up to us is everything else. health, reputation, other people's behavior, political events, and money, the accumulation of property, the security of material holdings, was squarely in the second category, firmly among the things that fortune owned and distributed and withdrew at its own discretion without asking permission from the person who happened, for a while, to be holding them. Epictetus was not making this argument in comfortable circumstances. He had been born a slave and spent years of his life as the property of a Roman freedman named Epaphroditus, who worked in Nero's court. He had experienced the enforced version of having nothing, not the voluntary simplicity of a philosopher who chooses poverty as an experiment, but the actual condition of owning no property by legal definition, of being himself property rather than holding any. When Epictetus said that external goods were outside our control, he was not describing a situation he had only thought about. He was describing something his life had given him direct and involuntary knowledge of. This is worth noting, not for the emotional weight of his experience, but for what it did to the philosophical argument. It gave it the authority of being genuinely held, rather than merely asserted. After he was freed, Epictetus began teaching and eventually established a school in Nicopolis on the western coast of Greece. He owned very little by choice at that point, apparently living simply in a small house. His teaching drew students from across the Roman world, including people of considerable wealth and social standing, and he did not exempt them from the logic of the dichotomy. If a person grounded their sense of well-being in the security of their property, Epictetus told them, they had placed that sense of well-being entirely at the mercy of events they could not control. They had given fortune the key to what should have been an inner room that fortune could not enter. The practical consequence was a life lived in permanent, low-grade anxiety, the anxiety of someone who knows that the thing their peace depends on could be taken at any moment, by a market collapse, a political reversal, a fire, a flood, or simply the slow deterioration of time. The freedom Epictetus was pointing toward was not freedom from poverty. It was freedom from the belief that poverty would be unbearable. Those two things look similar from the outside, but are entirely different from the inside. The person who fears poverty and the person who has made philosophical peace with the possibility of poverty may be holding exactly the same amount of money in exactly the same circumstances, but they are living in entirely different interior conditions. One of them is always in the anteroom of catastrophe, watching the door. The other has found, through sustained philosophical attention, that the door they were watching no longer leads anywhere that undoes them. Epictetus's version of the Stoic argument had a precision and a consistency that came partly from the simplicity of his life, and partly from the clarity of his thinking, and partly from the way those two things had combined in him, over many years, into something that felt less like a philosophical position and more like a way of breathing. He was not, by most accounts, a warm teacher in the soft sense. He was demanding. He expected his students to take the argument seriously enough to let it change how they actually lived, not merely how they spoke. The lectures that Arrian recorded have a quality of impatience with half measures, an insistence that philosophy done correctly transforms the person holding it, and that philosophy done for show or for reputation changes nothing that matters. And Zeno's original claim, spoken under those painted battle scenes on the northern edge of the agora, had traveled a long way from Athens by the time it reached Epictetus in Nicopolis. It had passed through Chrysippus's systematic refinements, through the Middle Stoics who had adapted it for Roman political life, through the Senate and the imperial court, and the provincial schools and the libraries, where thoughtful people in every corner of the Roman world had read their way into its assumptions and argued with them and found themselves changed by the arguing. The claim had been tested against every kind of circumstance: wealth, exile, enslavement, political triumph, political ruin, and it had held its essential shape through all of those tests, not because it was easy, but because its central insight was stubborn and difficult to genuinely argue away. Virtue is the only unconditional good. Everything else, everything that fortune can give or take, belongs to a different category. Pursuing those other things through rational effort is reasonable and sometimes wise. Losing them is not the catastrophe it feels like from inside the fear of losing them. The inner life, carefully cultivated, is the one thing that no external event can simply remove. This is the architecture. Everything else is its furniture. The Stoic account of preferred indifference gave the school something genuinely difficult to arrive at philosophically, a way of being in the world of material goods that was neither ascetic withdrawal nor rapacious acquisition, but a kind of engaged, clear-eyed, lightly held participation. The person who has understood it is not performing poverty and not chasing wealth. They are going about the ordinary business of a life in which material goods play their ordinary role, supporting functioning, enabling generosity, providing the material basis for the responsibilities that come with being embedded in a family and a community, without those goods having been elevated into the thing that makes the life worth living. What makes the life worth living, in the Stoic account, is the quality of judgment and character that the person brings to the living of it, and that quality is not something fortune can give them. It is something they have to build, slowly, through the accumulated practice of honest attention and repeated choice. To the externals can help or hinder this work in a modest way. Grinding poverty makes philosophical practice harder, just as serious illness does. The Stoics were not naive about this. They acknowledged that preferred indifference were genuinely preferable for real reasons, not merely as a concession to human weakness. But the help or hindrance that external circumstances provided was of a different order of magnitude from the importance of the inner work itself. A person with very little, working seriously at virtue, was philosophically closer to the goal than a person with great wealth who had never asked the question. The material advantage was real, but minor. The philosophical advantage was decisive. Chrysippus's distinction between proegmena and aproproegmena was not, in the end, a permission slip for philosophical complacency. It was a careful description of the rational relationship to external goods that a person who has genuinely understood the primary claim, virtue alone is the unconditional good, would naturally hold. The preference for health over sickness is not a contradiction of Stoic philosophy. It is what Stoic philosophy looks like when it is being applied by a rational person in ordinary life, making ordinary decisions about how to spend their time and their energy and their resources. The philosophy does not require a person to stop preferring better circumstances over worse ones. It requires them to hold that preference at the right level of intensity, firmly enough to motivate sensible action, lightly enough that its frustration does not undermine the inner stability that virtue requires. This is a finer distinction than it sounds. The difference between preferring wealth and being governed by the preference for wealth is not a difference that an outside observer could necessarily detect. It is an inner distinction, a difference in the quality of the attachment rather than its object. Two people might both pursue similar careers, accumulate similar property, live in similar houses, and from the outside be entirely indistinguishable in their relationship to material goods. But one of them has organized their inner life around those goods, made their sense of security and identity dependent on their presence, and lives with a background anxiety that tracks the fluctuations of fortune. the way a compass tracks north. The other holds the same goods with a different kind of attention, present to them, grateful for them, willing to use them well, but not leaning on them for the weight that only virtue can actually bear. The practical difficulty is that it is genuinely hard to know, from the inside, which of these two people one actually is. This is a problem the Stoics took seriously. Seneca took it seriously. The preference can present itself as lightly held when it is in fact gripping. The philosophical vocabulary can be available without the philosophical reality being present. A person can speak convincingly about virtue as the only good, while their actual emotional reactions, the anxiety when markets decline, the relief when the accounts are favorable, the depression that follows financial loss, reveal a different inner arrangement entirely. Seneca was honest enough about this difficulty to name it in his own case. He had the arguments. He had been living with the arguments for decades, and still, watching his own reactions, he was not always certain that the arguments had done the full depth of work they described. The image of the prokopton, the person in genuine progress, walking toward the ideal without having arrived, is useful precisely because it holds this kind of ongoing uncertainty without collapsing into either despair or denial. The prokopton is not pretending to have resolved what has not been resolved. The prokopton is also not using the gap between aspiration and achievement as evidence that the effort is futile. The work continues. The distance from the ideal is honestly acknowledged. The direction of movement is what gives the life its philosophical character, not the proximity to the destination. Seneca returned to this frame repeatedly in the letters, sometimes with a directness that sounds almost confessional. In one letter, he describes noticing that after a period of illness, returning to his studies and his writing, he could feel the difference, a difference in the quality of his thinking, in the stability of his mood, in his relationship to the ordinary irritations of daily life. The philosophy was having an effect. He could perceive the effect from the inside, but he was careful not to interpret this as a rival. It was the experience of progress, not the experience of completion. And he kept writing from there, from the position of someone who knows the direction without having covered all the distance. Zeno, walking under those painted walls in Athens, could not have known what his teaching would become across the following centuries. The courts and the libraries and the slave quarters and the emperor's chambers, where his fundamental claim would be turned over, tested, refined, resisted, and ultimately held on to by people whose circumstances were as different from each other as circumstances can be. He was making an argument about what happiness required and what it did not require, and the argument was radical enough to stay unsettled for a long time. The Stoa Poikile is gone now, archaeologically documented, but physically absent, its painted walls carried off or crumbled. The philosophers who taught there persisted in the texts that other philosophers read and copied and argued with across the generations, each of them arriving at something like the same place. The recognition that the question Zeno raised under those painted walls, what does a happy life actually require, and how much of what we think we need do we actually need, is not the kind of question that gets answered once and stays answered. Seneca, writing in Latin more than 3 centuries after Zeno, to a friend named Lucilius, who lived in Sicily and whom he would likely never see again, was still working on the same question. He had been working on it his whole life. He had accumulated an enormous amount of what the Stoics would call preferred indifference, and had watched his own inner relationship to those accumulations closely enough to know that possession had not resolved anything. The question was still there, patient and open, as available at the end of a long philosophical life as it had been at the beginning. He called himself a prakoptone, not a sage, not a person who had arrived at the philosophical destination and could now look back on the difficulty from a position of achieved clarity. A person in progress, a person whose lamp was still lit. The designation was precise, and in its precision, something steadier than any claim to completion would have been. A person who claims to have arrived somewhere can be shown to be wrong. A person who acknowledges that they are genuinely on the way, who measures the distance to the ideal with neither shame nor indifference, who keeps moving in the known direction without demanding that the journey end before they are ready. That person is describing something that does not depend on circumstances for its validity. The progress is real, the direction is real, the destination remains distant and clear, casting enough light to navigate by. That light, in the Stoic account, is what virtue is, not a rule, not a set of constraints, a kind of illumination that a person cultivates in themselves through long effort and honest attention, and that once cultivated changes what they can see, what counts as wealth and what counts as poverty, what is worth the weight of desire and what can be held lightly and released without grief. Zeno walked under the painted warriors on the wall of the Stoa Poikile and said that none of the things those warriors were fighting for were the thing that happiness actually required. Chrysippus said they were worth preferring, rationally and without shame, as long as the preference was kept in its proper place. Epictetus said the proper place was nowhere near the center of a person's inner life, which was the only territory fortune could not invade. And Seneca, sitting with all of this across many years and many letters, said something that held all three at once, that he was not a wise man, that he did not expect to become one, but that the direction of his effort was toward wisdom, toward that unconditional inner stability that external goods could neither create nor destroy, and that the direction honestly maintained and honestly measured was enough to keep the lamp lit through the uncertainty of whatever the night still held. Lucius Annaeus Seneca addressed the opening words of De Vita Beata to his brother Gallio, and there is something in that gesture worth sitting with before the argument itself arrives. He did not address them to the Senate or to Nero's court or to the abstract philosophical public. He wrote them to a brother, the treatise on the happy life, its defense of wealth, its account of virtue, its careful reasoning about what a wise man may and may not allow himself to want, came into the world in the form of a letter to a person Seneca loved. That is where the philosophy lives, not in the lecture hall, not on the debate stage, but in the particular warmth of a man turning towards someone he has known since childhood and saying, "Let me tell you what I think about this. Let me try to say it honestly." The question Seneca was taking up in that treatise, written around 58 CE, when his wealth and influence were at their height, was not a comfortable one for him to answer. He had more than most Romans would accumulate in several lifetimes. His gardens, his villas, his estates, his lending operations, these were the material furniture of a life that did not obviously resemble the philosophical program he was articulating. And yet he opened De Vita Beata not with an apology and not with an evasion, but with something closer to a philosophical clarification, the kind a man makes when he has thought about a problem long enough to know where the real difficulty lies and where the apparent difficulty dissolves on examination. The apparent difficulty was simple enough to state: how could a man who owned so much speak with any authority about the sufficiency of virtue and the relative unimportance of material goods? The real difficulty was more interesting. Seneca's answer was not that wealth doesn't matter, or that he happened to be indifferent to the wealth he had accumulated. His answer was more precise than either of those positions. He argued that the happy life consists in virtue alone, in the fully rational, fully oriented soul living in accordance with its own nature, and that this truth neither requires poverty nor endorses it. The man who performs poverty as a philosophical gesture, Seneca suggested, is making a mistake that mirrors the mistake of the man who worships wealth as the path to happiness. Both have confused the instrument for the thing. That word instrument carries most of the weight of his position, and it is worth staying with it for a moment. A tool has no moral character of its own. A blade is neither cruel nor kind. What matters is the hand that holds it, the quality of attention behind it, the degree to which the person using it remains the master of the tool rather than its servant. Seneca had made a version of this argument in De Vita Beata when he compared wealth to a sword placed in a soldier's hand, the weapon taking its moral character entirely from the steadiness of the person carrying it. The question he was really asking, beneath all the philosophical apparatus, was this: what kind of hand holds the wealth, and does the wealth change the hand, or does the hand remain itself? There is no settled answer to that question in Seneca's writings. It continues to turn through his letters and essays like something unresolved, something he kept returning to in the hours when the argument did not quite satisfy him. But the direction of his thinking was clear, and it opened onto a set of practical claims about how a person might actually inhabit material life. Not as an ascetic, not as a sensualist, but as someone who has cultivated a particular quality of relationship to things, holding them without being held by them. The fear of poverty, Seneca argued in his letters to Lucilius, is more destructive than poverty itself. This is not a consoling platitude. It is a precise psychological observation with a particular philosophical weight behind it. A person who has not made genuine peace with the possibility of losing what they have will conduct their financial life in a state of chronic, low-level agitation. The agitation does not lift when the wealth increases, because wealth accumulated by a frightened mind does not reassure the fear, it simply raises the stakes. More to lose, more to guard, more to fear losing. The chain grows heavier as the wealth grows larger, and the person at the center of it all is no freer than the person who began with nothing, and in some ways considerably less free, because the field of their anxiety has expanded to match the field of their holdings. In letter 17 of the Epistula Moralis, Seneca wrote to Lucilius about this, with the directness of a man who has watched the mechanism operate at close range, perhaps partly in himself. The primary source of financial suffering, he argued, is not the fact of having little, but the fear of having less. The person who has genuinely worked through that fear, not suppressed it, not argued it away intellectually, but actually confronted it, and arrived at something like philosophical settlement, that person is free in a way that no amount of accumulated wealth can buy. They hold what they have without clinging to it. They pursue more when more seems reasonable and useful. They stop when they notice the pursuit beginning to govern them rather than the other way around. The freedom is internal, and it is arrived at by internal means, and Seneca was specific about what those means involved. He described an exercise in letter 18 that is easy to misread if one comes to it expecting either performance or prescription. Seneca recommended to Lucilius a period of voluntary simplicity, a few days or a week, eating plainly, drinking water, sleeping without luxury, wearing rough clothing. He was careful to explain what this exercise was not. It was not an endorsement of permanent poverty. It was not a public demonstration of philosophical seriousness. It was not a mortification of the flesh In the religious sense, the body disciplined to prove the spirit's dominance. It was a private experiment with a specific philosophical purpose, to find out through direct experience rather than theoretical argument whether the feared floor was actually as terrible as anxiety had painted it. Most people, when they imagine losing their comforts, imagine a catastrophe. The imagination, when it is governed by fear, tends to amplify the threat and darken the picture. What Seneca was proposing was a way of testing that picture against reality, of actually sitting with the plain bread, the rough mat, the absence of the usual small pleasures, and discovering what the experience actually contains, rather than what the fearful imagination projects onto it. The discovery, he suggested, is almost always the same. The feared minimum is bearable. The self survives. The mind continues to function. The capacity for philosophical thought is not impaired by the absence of fine wine. And having made this discovery through experience rather than argument, the fear loses much of its power. The imagination no longer has a blank canvas to fill with catastrophe, because the canvas has been filled in with something real, and what is real is that a person can live simply and remain themselves. After a few days of voluntary plainness, Seneca wrote, "Return to the life you have, and notice the difference, not the difference in circumstances, the difference in relationship to circumstances. The food that seemed ordinary before may arrive with a quality of appreciation that was not there when it was taken for granted. The comfort that was simply the background condition of life becomes visible as a comfort, and visible comfort is something that can be held with something closer to gratitude than possession. The exercise does not require permanent poverty. It requires temporary contact with simplicity sufficient to demonstrate that simplicity is not catastrophe, and to calibrate the mind's sense of what it actually needs. This is the philosophical logic Seneca was working with when he described what sufficiency means. He was not arguing for a fixed number, not saying that a wise man needs this much and no more, that the threshold of adequacy sits at precisely this point on the scale of Roman sesterces. He was arguing for a psychological criterion. Sufficiency is the point at which additional wealth begins to cost more than it returns, not in money, but in the things that actually matter: attention, equanimity, the quality of one's relationships, the capacity to sleep at night without reviewing calculations, the freedom to say no to an opportunity that would require the abandonment of something morally important. By that measure, sufficiency is a moving boundary and a personal one. It shifts with circumstance and with the quality of a person's philosophical development. A person who has not cultivated the internal freedom Seneca is describing may find that no number is enough, because the insufficiency is not in the account, but in the soul. A person who has genuinely done the inner work may find that quite a modest holding is sufficient, because they have discovered through experience that their actual needs are considerably simpler than their anxious imagination suggested. The number matters less than the relationship to the number. The holdings matter less than the quality of attention that manages them. Seneca was aware that this argument could sound like a sophisticated rationalization, a wealthy man telling himself that his wealth is fine because he could theoretically let it go, without ever being tested by actually letting it go. He did not deflect this concern so much as acknowledge it and hold it alongside the argument. The test is not always available. A person does not always get to choose the conditions under which their philosophical claims are verified. What they can do is train themselves, through small and voluntary tests, to move toward the internal condition that the argument describes, and to measure their progress not by the philosophical consistency of their statements, but by the actual quality of their equanimity when circumstances shift. In those exercises, the plain bread, the rough mat, the week of deliberate simplicity, Seneca was not claiming to have resolved the difficulty. He was offering a practice that moves in the direction of resolution, a way of building the psychological condition that the argument requires, piece by piece, from the inside out. What Seneca was assembling across these letters and essays was something that might be called a practical account of the wise relationship to material life. Not an abstract doctrine, but a set of genuine philosophical moves that a real person in real circumstances could actually make. The first move was the reconciliation with simplicity, the voluntary encounter with the feared minimum that drains the catastrophe out of poverty's image. The second move was the cultivation of sufficiency as a psychological criterion, not a fixed threshold, but a quality of attention, a willingness to notice when the pursuit of more has begun to cost more than it returns. And the third move, perhaps the most practically and philosophically interesting of the three, was a sustained account of the proper role of generosity. In De Beneficis, the essay on benefits, on gifts, on the philosophy of giving, Seneca developed what amounts to a full account of why a wise man might reasonably want to hold material resources at all. The argument is not about personal use. It is not about the pleasures that wealth makes available, or the comfort it provides, or even the philosophical security of knowing that one can meet one's needs without dependence on others. The deepest philosophical reason Seneca could find for a wise man to hold wealth was the capacity it creates for genuine generosity. Generosity, in Seneca's account, is among the highest expressions of virtue, not because giving is virtuous in some simple, obvious sense, but because genuine giving requires the full exercise of the virtues that matter most. It requires wisdom to know what actually helps the recipient rather than what merely flatters the giver's desire to be seen giving. It requires justice to give in proportion to what the situation genuinely calls for, to the right person, at the right moment, in the right way. It requires courage to give without the safety net of expectation, to release something of value without calculating what will return, without building a ledger, without the subtle insurance of obligation. And it requires, perhaps above all, a freedom from the anxiety around holding that makes real release possible. A person governed by financial fear cannot give freely. They can give strategically. They can give in ways that will return something: influence, obligation, reputation, the pleasurable feeling of having been seen as generous. But the open hand that Seneca was describing in De Beneficis, the hand that gives because the soul has understood virtue and cannot keep entirely closed, requires precisely the internal freedom that the philosophical exercises were designed to cultivate. The connection between the voluntary encounter with simplicity and the capacity for genuine generosity is not incidental, it is structural. The person who has made peace with having less is the person who can give without the giving being a performance of safety. There is a figure in De Beneficis that Seneca returns to more than once: the image of the gift given without a ledger kept, the benefit extended without a name being placed against it in any internal account. He was not describing naivety. He was not arguing that practical wisdom plays no role in deciding when and how and to whom one gives. He was describing a quality of inner freedom in the act of giving, the difference between generosity as a transaction and generosity as an expression of something that does not require a return, because the soul that offers it is already oriented toward the good and simply acts from that orientation. A person who has understood this does not give less carefully, they give differently. The calculation that governs the gift is no longer the calculation of return, but the calculation of genuine benefit, what will actually help, what the situation actually requires, what the moment genuinely calls for. This is a harder calculation than the financial one, and it demands more of a person, not less. But it is also the calculation that leaves the giver intact, the gift clean, the relationship between giver and recipient standing on real ground rather than the shifting floor of mutual obligation. One of the subtler things Seneca was doing in De Beneficis was identifying generosity as one of the primary philosophical justifications for holding material resources. If a wise man is to give well, to give wisely, justly, freely, at the right moment and to the right degree, then a wise man needs something to give. The resources are not ends in themselves. They are the material condition for a practice that is itself among the highest expressions of virtue. This does not mean that more is always better. Seneca was clear that the accumulation of resources beyond what genuine generosity requires begins to reverse its own justification, consuming the attention and equanimity that wise giving demands. But it does mean that a man who holds wealth for the purpose of giving it well is doing something philosophically coherent, something that fits within the structure of the argument rather than straining against it. The question of sufficiency returns here in a different register. Enough to live well, enough to give well, enough to meet the obligations of friendship and family and civic life without the constant friction of financial pressure, and no more than enough to maintain the inner freedom that makes the holding worthwhile. That is the ideal Seneca was articulating across the letters and essays, never quite as a fixed prescription, but always as a kind of orientation, a direction of travel, a way of asking the question that already represents progress toward the answer. He was not describing a life he had fully achieved. This is worth saying plainly, because Seneca said it himself, more than once, in ways that carry the weight of genuine honesty rather than false modesty. His holdings were far beyond any reasonable account of sufficiency, as he himself defined it. The estates, the villas, the lending operations across the empire, these were not, by Seneca's own philosophical measure, evidence of a perfectly calibrated relationship to material life. He knew this. He continued to argue for the calibration anyway, not because he had achieved it, but because he believed it was the right target, and because arguing for it honestly was itself part of the philosophical practice. There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty in arguing for an ideal one, has not fully lived up to, not as an excuse, not as a performance of self-deprecation, but as a genuine attempt to hold both the ideal and the reality clearly in view at the same time. Seneca was doing this throughout his mature writing. He was saying, here is what I think the wise relationship to material life looks like. Here is the argument for it. Here is the practice I recommend. And I am not the finished example of it. The distance between the argument and the life is real, and I am not asking anyone to overlook it. What I am asking is for the argument to be evaluated on its merits, and for the practice to be assessed by whether it moves a person in the right direction, toward inner freedom, toward genuine generosity, toward the capacity to hold fortune's gifts without being governed by the fear of their loss. That quality of honest distance between the ideal and the practice is one of the things that makes Seneca's philosophical writing feel lived rather than performed. He was not transcribing a condition he had already achieved. He was thinking through a difficulty he was genuinely inside, and the thinking has the texture of real philosophical work rather than the smooth surface of a finished doctrine. A man walking through a marketplace with genuine philosophical freedom carries nothing invisible, not the invisible chain that connects the anxious buyer to the things on the shelves, not the constant background calculation of what to acquire and what to avoid, and what the acquisition will mean, and how the meaning will be perceived. He walks through the same space as everyone else. He sees the same things. He may even buy some of them, but the relationship is different in a way that is entirely internal and entirely real. He is not governed by the marketplace. The marketplace is simply a place he passes through. This is the image Seneca kept circling back to. Not the man who owns nothing, not the man who has withdrawn from commercial life into philosophical simplicity, but the man who moves through the material world without being moved by it in the ways that most people, most of the time, are moved. The Stoic philosophical ideal is not the monk's cell, but the philosopher in the forum, present, engaged, practically effective, capable of genuine generosity, and at the same time internally free, in a way that does not depend on what the forum contains or fails to contain on any given day. The navigator image which Seneca used in his letters captures something of this. A navigator setting out on a sea voyage carries provisions, food, fresh water, the materials necessary for the passage. They carry them not out of attachment to the provisions, not out of fear that without them the sea will be unlivable, but because adequate supplies make the passage possible. The provisions serve the voyage. They do not constitute it. If the sea demands them, in storm, in accident, in the necessity of some emergency, they can be released. They were never confused with the destination. They were always understood as the means. The person who has reached something like Seneca's ideal holds their material resources the way the navigator holds provisions, not clutched tight against the possibility of loss, not regarded with the kind of attention that makes losing them feel like losing a piece of the self. Held ready, used well, given freely when the moment calls for it, and released without catastrophe when the release is required. The voyage continues. The sea remains open. The image is not one of emptiness or of willful deprivation. The navigator is not sailing without provisions to prove that they can. They are sailing with provisions that they hold lightly, and the lightness of the hold is the thing the philosophy has to teach, not the absence of things, but the quality of one's relationship to them, not the bare hand, but the open one, capable of holding, capable of giving, and not confused in any quiet moment of honest reflection about which is which. Seneca's arguments in De Vita Beata and the letters amount, in the end, to something simpler than their philosophical vocabulary might suggest. He was asking what it actually costs a person to accumulate and guard more than they genuinely need, asking not in financial terms, but in terms of attention, of equanimity, of the quality of daily experience, of the kind of person one is becoming in the process of accumulation. He was suggesting that the cost is higher than most people notice, because much of it is paid in the currency of inner life, and the exchange rate between inner peace and material security is one that financial calculation is not well designed to assess. The person who has spent their middle decades in anxious accumulation may arrive at a point of substantial holdings without having noticed the purchase price, the sleep disturbed by calculation, the friendships complicated by financial interest, the moral compromises made small and then large in the service of financial advancement, the quality of attention that was given to the margins of the account rather than the center of the life. Seneca was not arguing that this always happens. He was arguing that it tends to happen, and that the philosophical work of cultivating sufficiency is precisely the work of keeping the cost visible before it has been paid without reflection. The voluntary encounter with simplicity, the few days of plain food, the rough mat, the deliberate stepping down of accustomed comfort, is in part a way of making that cost visible before it is incurred invisibly. A person who knows through experience that they can live simply without catastrophe is a person who has given themselves a real choice. Not the theoretical choice that everyone technically has, but the lived, experienced, genuinely felt choice of a person who has tested the feared alternative and found it survivable. That is a different kind of freedom than the freedom of someone who has never faced the test, and it is worth considerably more. Sufficiency, by this account, is not a number on a scale. It is not the point at which a specific material threshold has been met. It is a quality of psychological settledness, achieved through practice and maintained through ongoing attention, that allows a person to hold what they have without gripping, to pursue what seems genuinely useful without being governed by the pursuit, and to give freely when the moment calls for it, because the hand has been trained to open. The question is not how much is enough. The question is whether one has done the work that makes the question answerable, and whether the answer one arrives at is genuinely felt or merely claimed. In the long light of a Roman afternoon, the philosopher who has sat with this question long enough feels it differently than the person who has merely argued it. The argument is the beginning. The practice that follows the argument is the next thing. And what comes after sustained practice, after the voluntary simplicity, the careful observation of one's own relationship to things, the honest examination of what the accumulation is actually costing in terms of inner freedom, is something quieter than philosophy and something more useful. It is the settled quality of a person who knows what they need and has stopped being governed by the fear of having less. It is the hand that holds provisions for the voyage, held ready, held well, and when the sea asks for them, released, not without grief necessarily, not with the performed indifference of a philosopher who has never loved anything enough to miss its loss, but with a steadiness that does not mistake the provisions for the voyage, and does not confuse the things held in the hand for the person doing the holding. That steadiness is what Seneca was pointing toward in the letters and the essays, through the arguments, through the exercises, through the honest acknowledgement of his own distance from the ideal, through the image of the open hand. The sea ahead is still open. The provisions are adequate. The navigator is not governed by the fear of the storm that may or may not come, because the work of philosophical preparation has already been done, not completed, never entirely completed, but genuinely underway, genuinely moving in the right direction, the hand a little lighter than it was, the voyage still itself, the destination still the same. In Letter 2 of the Epistulae Moralis, Seneca does something a reader might not expect. He is writing to Lucilius, his younger friend and student, and he has barely begun the correspondence before he reaches across the philosophical border and quotes Epicurus, not to refute him, not to identify where the rival school went wrong. He quotes him with the care of a man who has found something worth keeping, and then sets the sentence down on the page without apology. The sentence he quotes is this: "It is pleasant to make one's needs small." The Stoic philosopher writing to his Stoic student, opening with the words of a man whose school taught a different account of the good life, different enough that the two traditions had been arguing for 3 centuries by the time Seneca put his pen to papyrus. The gesture is small. Its implications are not. What it reveals, in that quiet crossing of philosophical lines, is that Seneca understood the conversation about wealth and happiness to be larger than any single school, older than any single argument, and honest enough to require listening to voices that reach different conclusions from one's own. The ancient world had no shortage of such voices. They had been speaking across the centuries for as long as philosophy had been practiced in the Mediterranean, each one approaching the same fundamental question from a different angle, and each one finding something real. Epicurus had founded his school in Athens in a garden, an actual garden, purchased and cultivated sometime around 306 BCE. The name stuck to his community and to his approach, the garden, a place of philosophical friendship, plain food, and deliberate withdrawal from the competitive noise of Athenian public life. Epicurus argued that pleasure was the natural end of human existence, but he was careful, painstakingly careful, about what he meant by pleasure, not the banquet, not the acquisition, not the applause of crowds. The pleasures that Epicurus valued most were what he called katastematic pleasures, the stable, undisturbed pleasures of a body that is not hungry and a mind that is not troubled. Bread and olives and philosophical conversation in the late afternoon, the company of people who had chosen one another honestly. These, he argued, were not consolation prizes for the absence of wealth. They were themselves the finest thing worth wanting. His reasoning was practical, almost economic in its precision. Great wealth brings great anxiety. The person who has acquired much has also acquired the fear of losing much, the complicated social obligations that attend large possessions, the political exposure that comes with financial prominence. The man with the crowded house must maintain the crowded house. The man with the reputation for extraordinary prosperity must defend that reputation. Every additional acquisition brings with it a corresponding set of vulnerabilities, a new surface area for misfortune to find its grip. The simpler life, Epicurus argued, was not philosophically inferior to the prosperous one. In the only currency that mattered, ataraxia, the undisturbed state of a mind that has settled into contentment, the garden in Athens was richer than the villa with 1,000 acres. Seneca read Epicurus seriously and said so. There is a running philosophical courtesy in the early letters to Lucilius, a willingness to acknowledge that the Epicurean conclusions, however different from Stoic premises, were pointing at something genuinely worth seeing. Both schools, Seneca observed, arrived at a similar practical place. The man who has made himself small in his needs, who has genuinely reduced his dependence on external fortune, lives more freely than the man who has expanded his requirements until he cannot survive without a certain level of material comfort. The paths were different. The destination was recognizable from either road. Still, Seneca was a Stoic, and the Stoic account of what Epicurus was missing had its own precision. The Epicurean sage withdrew. He cultivated the garden, maintained the small community of friends, and stepped back from civic obligation, from political life, from the tangle of Roman ambition and public service. Seneca regarded this withdrawal with genuine philosophical sympathy and with genuine reservation. The wise person, on the Stoic account, was not someone who arranged their life to minimize exposure to the world. The wise person entered the world, served, argued, administered, wrote, engaged, and remained free within that engagement, not by standing apart from the current, but by moving through it without being carried away. This was the argument, and it was also, obviously, Seneca's own position as a man who had spent years at the center of the most powerful court in the known world. Whether the argument was philosophical principle or elaborate self-justification has been a question in the room since Publius Suius first raised it in the Roman Senate. What cannot be denied is that the argument is real, and that its relationship to a life like Seneca's is genuinely complicated, rather than simply convenient. The Senecas had a different answer entirely, and it arrived not in words, but in a person, in the specific and deliberately provocative person of Diogenes, of Sinope, living in a large storage jar in Corinth in the 4th century BCE, owning almost nothing, demanding almost nothing, and making the philosophical point by the sheer fact of his existence rather than by argument. Diogenes had arrived at his philosophical position the hard way, through exile from his native city, through the loss of everything that ordinarily constitutes a life, and had found on the other side of that loss something he could not have expected to find, a kind of freedom so radical that it could afford to be cheerful about it. The story of Diogenes and Alexander has the quality of a scene too perfect to have been entirely invented, though it may have been. Alexander the Great, in the full confidence of his conquests, sought out the famous philosopher who lived in the jar in Corinth, approached him with his entourage, and offered to grant him anything he wished. Diogenes, lying in the winter sunlight, looked up and asked him to step out of his light. Alexander, by most accounts, was not offended. He stood for a moment in the particular silence of a man who has just encountered something he cannot purchase, and said that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. Whether Alexander meant this, whether he understood what he was saying, whether the freedom Diogenes possessed would have survived wealth and power if tested by them, these are the questions that come after the story. The story itself records a genuine philosophical collision. The Cynic argument was that all external goods, wealth, reputation, social standing, physical comfort, conventional respectability, were not merely indifferent, but actively obstructive. They cluttered the self. They built up a scaffolding of dependence and obligation that made genuine inner freedom structurally impossible. The only path to real freedom, on this view, was radical external simplicity: own nothing, need nothing, depend on nothing, that fortune can take away. The jar in Corinth was not merely Diogenes's house, it was his argument, visible and inhabitable. Seneca engaged with this position respectfully and did not dismiss it. In De Vita Beata, he acknowledged the Cynic program with something close to admiration, the admiration one extends to a position that has a real philosophical point, even if it goes further than one is prepared to follow. The point the Cynics had right was the fundamental Stoic point, that inner freedom does not depend on external possession, that the self is not constituted by its holdings, that a person can lose everything and remain, in the most important sense, intact. Where Seneca parted from the Cynics was on the conclusion that follows: the withdrawal from the world, the theatrical rejection of all conventional goods, the deliberate reduction of social existence to its absolute minimum. These were, in Seneca's account, a different kind of performance. The Stoic ideal was not renunciation but engagement, not the demonstrative jar, but the philosophical table at which civic life, friendship, and material possession were all present, all held lightly, and none of them confused for happiness itself. There was also the question of obligations. The person who is withdrawn into radical simplicity has, by withdrawing, absolved themselves of a certain range of duties. They have stepped out of the family, the community, the political structure. On the Stoic account, this stepping out was not liberation, but a form of negligence. The wise person was owed something to the people around them, to friends who needed counsel, to students who needed teaching, to civic institutions that needed honest participation. Generosity, in the deep sense that Seneca develops in De Beneficiis, requires resources. The hand that gives freely must have something in it. Radical poverty might achieve perfect inner simplicity while failing, structurally, at half the obligations that matter to a human life. Aristotle had thought about this with his characteristic patience. In the Nicomachean Ethics, written in the 4th century BCE, he had made an argument that the Stoics spent considerable energy resisting, partly because it was difficult to refute entirely. The argument was that external goods, moderate wealth, physical health, good relationships, good birth, a community that functions well, were not merely preferred indifference, but genuine prerequisites for eudaimonia, the full flourishing of a human life. Not luxuries, not optional enhancements, actual requirements. Aristotle's reasoning was grounded in what he understood about the nature of human beings. People are social creatures, embedded in relationships, dependent on their bodies, inhabitants of communities. A person of genuine virtue, but entirely without friends, without the physical capacity to act, without any resources to put virtue into effect, such a person is not flourishing. They might have the disposition of virtue without the conditions in which virtue can express itself, and for Aristotle, the disposition without the expression was not enough. The acorn is not the oak. The virtuous disposition that has no circumstances in which to act is a kind of philosophical potential waiting for conditions that never arrive. The hard case was loss. Aristotle looked steadily at a man who has lost his children, his livelihood, his friends, and his health, and said plainly that such a man cannot be said to be flourishing, however much virtue he retains. The Stoic sage, on the official Stoic account, could be happy even on the rack, even in the worst of all possible circumstances, if the rational and virtuous disposition were intact. Happiness was intact. Aristotle looked at this claim and found it, not dishonest, but incomplete. It captured something about the independence of the virtuous mind. It failed to capture something about what human lives actually are. Seneca knew this argument and lived in its neighborhood. He never fully conceded it. To do so would have been to abandon the foundational Stoic claim that virtue is the only unconditional good. But the traces of Aristotelian acknowledgement are visible in his work. The insistence on friendship as philosophically important, the account of generosity in De Beneficiis, which makes the giving of genuine gifts a central expression of virtue rather than a peripheral one, the recognition, threading through the letters, that a person genuinely stripped of everything they love is in a situation that philosophy cannot simply think its way out of, even if philosophy can make the situation more bearable. Seneca does not resolve this tension. He lives in it, honestly. Plato's account of wealth and the soul had a different center of gravity. In the Republic, written in the 4th century BCE, Plato was interested less in whether external goods were genuine goods, and more in what the love of money does to a person's inner life. His account is of a type, the oligarchic character, and it is drawn with the clinical precision of someone who has spent time observing the phenomenon. The oligarchic man, in Plato's portrait, is not a villain. He is on the surface respectable. He pays his debts, he maintains his civic duties, he does not commit obvious crimes. He has arranged his life around the careful management of financial reputation. But underneath the respectable surface, the soul is differently organized. The part of the soul that reasons, that asks what is genuinely good, genuinely just, genuinely worth choosing, has been subordinated to the part that calculates. Every decision runs through the filter of financial consequence. Genuine friendship is structurally unavailable to him because genuine friendship requires giving without calculation, and the soul that has organized itself around financial prudence cannot give without calculation. Genuine courage is unavailable because genuine courage requires risking something, and the oligarchic soul cannot risk without anxiety. Genuine philosophical inquiry is unavailable because philosophical inquiry requires being willing to follow an argument wherever it leads, and the oligarchic soul will not follow an argument past the point where it becomes financially inconvenient. The love of money, in Plato's account, does not merely produce bad decisions, it reorganizes the soul around a bad principle of organization. It does not corrupt from the outside. It corrupts from inside by displacing the proper ruler, reason, with a calculating appetite that wears reason's clothes while serving appetite's interests. The oligarchic man thinks he is being prudent. He is being governed by a hunger that has never been examined long enough to see clearly what it actually is. Seneca read Plato. The letters are full of Platonic echoes, Platonic concerns, Platonic vocabulary held at a slight distance and examined in the light of Stoic commitments, the Platonic worry about the love of money, the philochromatin disposition, is visible in Seneca's own diagnostic work on what wealth does to the people who pursue it without philosophical preparation, the restless moving from one acquisition to the next, the inability to sit still with what one has, the grasping quality of attention that cannot let its holdings be enough. These are Senecan concerns as much as Platonic ones, and both philosophers arrived at them by looking at the same thing, what actually happens to actual people when they make money the center of a life. What Seneca added to the Platonic concern out of Stoic materials was a psychological account of how the inner disorder could be prevented or corrected. Plato described the corruption. Seneca was interested in the exercises that could resist it, the voluntary simplicity, the deliberate practice of having less, the cultivation of the inner orientation that Plato's oligarchic man had never bothered to develop. Plato's diagnosis was more penetrating. Seneca's practical prescription was more developed. Together they mapped a territory that neither one fully covered alone. Cato the Younger occupied a special position in Seneca's philosophical imagination. He was a historical figure, a Roman senator who had lived through the fall of the Republic, who had opposed Julius Caesar with a moral severity so uncompromising that it was widely understood to be a kind of philosophical statement as much as a political one. Seneca returned to Cato's image across many of his writings, held it up, turned it in the light, and regarded it with a quality of admiring attention that is not quite the same as simple admiration. Cato had lived with a moral austerity, notably more demanding than Seneca's own. He was not performing simplicity while maintaining a villa at Nomentum. His frugality was not an occasional voluntary exercise to demonstrate that the feared minimum was tolerable. It was a sustained, constitutive feature of a life organized around an uncompromising principle, that virtue is all, that compromise with fortune is a form of defeat, that the wise person holds the line regardless of what holding the line costs. When Caesar's victory became inevitable, and when surrender or flight were the only alternatives to death that remained available, Cato chose death. He read Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue about the immortality of the soul, in which Socrates approaches his own death with philosophical calm, and then he did what the argument seemed to him to require. Seneca returns to this image with a consistency that amounts to a confession. He cannot leave Cato alone. He writes about him in ways that make clear the distance between them, the distance between Cato's uncompromising line and Seneca's more accommodated, more wealthy, more politically entangled existence. And he writes about him in ways that make clear that this distance is not something he can resolve by argument. Cato is the argument that Seneca's own life raises against itself, the man who advised that virtue is all and that wealth is merely an instrument held in Seneca's own writings, a silent counterexample in Cato, someone who actually organized a life on that principle, without the villa, without the loans, without the 300 million sesterces, and who died rather than compromise it. What is notable is that Seneca does not resolve this. He does not argue that Cato was too extreme, that his position was philosophically excessive, that a more measured approach is equally virtuous. He holds the image of Cato with what can only be described as philosophical seriousness, the seriousness of a man who knows he is looking at something that does not simply let him off the hook, and continues writing, continues living, continues holding the tension that the image creates. This is, in its own way, philosophically honest, this honest acknowledgement that the ideal and the life are not identical, and that naming the gap does not close it, but refusing to close it by lowering the ideal. This is a different kind of philosophical courage than Cato's. Quieter, Irenil, less dramatic, perhaps less pure, but it is the philosophical courage that most people who have ever genuinely engaged with these questions have actually needed, because most people are not Cato. Most people live in the accommodation, in the entanglement, in the proximity to wealth and power that Stoic philosophy permits, but that Stoic philosophy also keeps examining, keeps refusing to let sleep undisturbed. The ancient debate about wealth, taken as a whole, has the quality of a conversation whose participants are genuinely trying to answer the same question and arriving at genuinely different places. Epicurus in the garden, arguing that simple pleasures are the finest pleasures, and that the anxieties of wealth outweigh its satisfactions, so that voluntary smallness is not a sacrifice, but a gain. Diogenes, in the jar in Corinth, arguing that every external dependence is a philosophical liability, and that the person who has reduced their dependence to nothing is the only person whose freedom cannot be taken. Aristotle in the Lyceum, arguing that virtue needs resources to express itself, that human flourishing is not purely inner, and that the complete removal of external goods leaves even a virtuous person in a position that cannot honestly be called flourishing. Plato in the Republic, watching what happens to the soul that organizes itself around financial acquisition, describing the inner corruption that follows not from wealth itself, but from the love of wealth as the organizing principle of a life. And Seneca sitting at his writing table in one of his Italian villas, holding all of these positions simultaneously, finding each of them partially right, and writing with the kind of honesty that comes from knowing that the argument he is making has consequences he is not fully satisfied. The conversation did not end with any of them. It has the quality of a question that philosophical history keeps setting down and returning to, finding it each time in approximately the same place it was left, unchanged by the interval, patient in the way that hard questions tend to be patient. Epicurus's argument about the anxiety of abundance still circulates in economies of conspicuous consumption that would have astonished him while confirming his diagnosis. Aristotle's insistence that human flourishing requires external conditions still surfaces in debates about what justice owes to people whose circumstances prevent virtue from finding expression. Plato's account of the oligarchic soul has a recognizable face in every culture that has organized its life around financial calculation, while telling itself that the calculation is really just prudence. The cynic's jar still makes its silent argument in the presence of any sufficiently crowded warehouse. Seneca's particular contribution to this conversation was not a resolution, but a quality of holding. He held the positions in relation to one another, held his own practice in honest relation to his philosophy, and kept writing the argument without pretending that his life had solved it. There is a kind of philosophical courage in this that is different from the courage of the sage, who has achieved perfect inner freedom and holds wealth without the slightest tremor of attachment. It is the courage of the Procoptone, the person still in progress, who can see where the argument leads without having arrived there, and who keeps moving in that direction without performing an arrival that has not occurred. The question Soilius raised in the Roman Senate, What philosophical school produces a fortune of 300 million sesterces was a political weapon. It was also a philosophical question in the precise sense. It asked whether the argument and the life were genuinely consistent, and it declined to accept the distinction between moral relationship and mere possession as sufficient answer. The ancient philosophical tradition, taken as a whole, did not settle the question either. Epicurus pointed at the garden and said that the question of whether wealth can be held without corrupting the holder is best answered by not holding very much. Diogenes pointed at the jar and said that the question dissolves when the external goods are gone. Aristotle pointed at the person who has lost everything and said that the question runs in both directions, that complete poverty is not the answer any more than complete wealth is. Plato pointed at the soul of the person doing the holding and said that the question is not about the quantity of the holding, but about what the holding has done to the inner life. And Seneca pointed at his writing table and said that he was working on it. The lamp in the library burns low. Cato is still reading. The garden in Athens is still receiving its people in the late afternoon. Bread on the table, the conversation still going. Diogenes is still watching the shadow of Alexander's entourage cross the ground outside his jar in Corinth. And Alexander is still standing at a slight distance from the philosopher he cannot give anything to, having said the truest thing he may ever have said, that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes, and not yet having moved. The question of whether wealth and wisdom can genuinely coexist, of what philosophy actually demands of a person in lived circumstances, has been set down here in the middle of many answers and left without a single one, the way real questions are always left, not resolved but inhabited, not settled but made familiar through long acquaintance, the question itself becoming, through that long acquaintance, something other than a problem, something closer to a companion, something that has been in the room long enough that its presence has its own quality of stillness, its own unhurried patience, turning slowly in the dark, long after the voices have quieted, after the garden has gone to sleep, after the lamp has burned down to a small and steady glow that asks nothing more of anyone still awake to see it. In the years between 62 and 65 of the Common Era, in the last quiet stretch of his life, Seneca sat down each day and wrote letters he knew might outlast him. The court of Nero was behind him now. The weight of imperial proximity, the negotiations, the performances, the careful navigation of a dangerous man's moods had been set down. What remained was a room, a lamp, a tablet, and Lucilius, the friend in Sicily to whom the letters were addressed. A friend real enough that the arguments were honest, and particular enough that the philosophy never hardened into doctrine. He wrote quickly some days and slowly on others. The letters are different lengths, different temperatures. Some read like a man who has just thought of something urgent. Others carry the quality of a long afternoon, an idea turned over in the hand until its weight becomes familiar. What they share, across all their differences, is the quality of a person who knows that time is finite, not as a philosophical abstraction, not as the kind of thing one says without meaning it, but as a lived condition, as the particular clarity that settles over a life when the horizon has grown close enough to see distinctly. He did not spend these final years in poverty. The estates were still there, the properties, the resources accumulated across decades of proximity to power. None of that had vanished when he withdrew. What had changed was not his material condition, but his relationship to it, or rather, in these letters, his continuing examination of that relationship, his honest return to the question of whether a man who has thought carefully about wealth and freedom has actually learned anything at all from the thinking, or merely accumulated the thoughts the way one accumulates anything else, heavily, without genuine change. The question the letters keep turning toward, in different light and from different angles, is the question of the animus, a Latin word that carries more than its nearest English translation suggests. It is not simply the mind, not simply the soul. It is the animating inner principle, the seat of attention and desire and judgment, the thing that can be cultivated or neglected, steadied or agitated, made free or enslaved by its own attachments. Seneca wrote about the animus the way a physician might write about an organ whose functioning determines the health of everything else, not as a metaphor, but as a practical diagnosis, something that can be examined, trained, brought to a better condition through deliberate practice. There is a passage in one of the early letters where he says simply that the man who fears poverty will always be poor. The sentence is short enough to pass over quickly, and the first time through, it can seem almost too simple. A neat saying, the kind of thing one writes down in a notebook and believes one has understood. But the more carefully the sentence is held, the more it opens. What Seneca is pointing at is not a paradox. He is pointing at a precise psychological mechanism that the inner experience of deprivation is not caused by the absence of resources, but by the constant anticipation of their loss, by the portion of the mind perpetually occupied with the inventory of what has been gathered and the vigilance required to hold it. A man with vast holdings who lives in dread of losing them inhabits, from the inside, a condition that is functionally indistinguishable from scarcity. The numbers in the ledger are different. The quality of the inner life is the same, and the converse follows with equal precision. The person who has made genuine philosophical peace with the possibility of having less, not as performance, not as a rehearsed speech about the nobility of poverty, but as a real psychological settlement arrived at through sustained honest attention, that person moves through a world of ordinary commerce and ordinary possession without the invisible chain. They may own things. They may prefer to keep them, but the things do not own the attention, do not govern the sleep, do not determine the temperature of the inner room. The inner room. Seneca returned to this image more than once, and it is worth pausing in it for a moment. The animus, properly cultivated, is a space that has its own weather, its own steadiness. It does not alter its character simply because the circumstances outside have shifted. A man who receives news of a financial loss and finds his inner life overturned by it has revealed something important, not about the loss, but about where he had been living. He had been living in the property, not in himself. The property was the room he actually inhabited, and when it was taken, the room was gone. The animus, as Seneca conceives it, is a space that cannot be confiscated, cannot be reduced by any external event, holds its temperature through cold and heat alike. This is not a claim that such equanimity is easy to achieve. Seneca never pretended it was. The letters are full of honest acknowledgment that the practice is difficult, that the mind resists it, that there are mornings when the old anxieties return and must be met again from the beginning. What the cultivation of the animus offers is not immunity from disturbance, but a stable place to return to, a center that continues to exist even after the disturbance has passed through. The way the ground continues to exist after a storm, changed perhaps, marked perhaps, but still there, still solid beneath the foot. The Stoic tradition had a name for the ruling faculty, the governing center of the self, hegemonikon, and another term for the capacity for free choice and judgment that no circumstance could override, prohairesis. These are technical terms, and their precision matters, but what Seneca added to them was a kind of warmth that the technical formulations alone do not carry. He was interested not just in the logical structure of inner freedom, but in its texture, in what it actually feels like to inhabit a mind that has been brought to a degree of genuine steadiness, in the daily practice that such steadiness requires. The letters are the practice made visible. They are what it looks like to keep working. There is a discipline Seneca describes in the letters that he had inherited from the broader Stoic tradition, a practice of deliberate imagining, of sitting quietly with the thought of adverse circumstances before they arrive. In Latin, it carries the name praemeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversities. The phrase can sound grim at first, even morbid. The suggestion that a wise practice involves rehearsing misfortune in the imagination. But the logic is precise and once felt, quite different from what the phrase initially suggests. The fear of loss draws much of its power from the imagination's refusal to look at what is feared directly. The mind circles the possibility of financial ruin, of losing what has been built, of finding itself with less, circles it, glances at it, looks away quickly, returns, circles again. Each circuit reinforces the dread without reducing it. The feared thing grows in proportion to how steadily it is refused a direct gaze. What premeditatio offers is the direct gaze itself, a voluntary, unhurried, honest imagining of the thing that is feared, not to damage the spirit, but to drain the fear of its disproportionate power. In Letter 24, Seneca writes about this at length. The person who has sat quietly with the thought, the income gone, the property reduced, the material circumstances stripped back to something far simpler, and has followed the thought all the way through without turning away, arrives at a particular discovery. The self survives the imagining, the animus remains. The things that mattered most, the quality of the attention, the relationship to one's own judgment, the inner life that no external authority ever actually controlled, these remain intact on the other side of the imagined loss. And this discovery, made in the quiet of an evening's deliberate reflection, does something to the fear. Not everything. The fear does not simply vanish, but its grip loosens. Its authority over the daily conduct of life reduces. The inventory taking and the vigilance relax their continuous demands on the attention. What Seneca is describing is a kind of training, not a single event, but a repeated practice, a returning to the same discipline across many evenings, the way a muscle is trained, not through one effort, but through accumulated patient work. The equanimity that results is not a natural condition, but an achieved one, earned through sustained honest attention to the things that disturb, through the willingness to look at the feared floor of circumstances, and recognize that the floor, while uncomfortable, is survivable. The floor, in Seneca's imagining, is always much higher than fear insists. The feared minimum, plain food, a small room, simple clothing, the conversation of one honest friend, is not a condition of devastation. It is, if the mind is properly oriented, a condition that retains everything that actually matters. The Stoics did not romanticize poverty. They did not argue that the simple life was superior to the comfortable one, or that one should pursue privation for its own sake. What they argued was that the distance between the minimum required for a good life and the maximum most people spend their lives pursuing is very wide, and that most of the suffering generated in that distance is not necessary. There is a second kind of poverty Seneca diagnosed with equal seriousness, and it appears across many of the letters and essays with a consistency that suggests it preoccupied him as much as financial anxiety ever did. This was the poverty of time, the quiet squandering of irreplaceable hours through distraction, through the service of other people's agendas, through the pursuit of additional material security beyond any reasonable threshold of sufficiency. In De Brevite Vitae, the essay on the shortness of life, he makes this argument with particular precision, and it inverts the conventional understanding of wealth and deprivation in a way that is striking. The person who guards their money with great care and gives away their time without noticing, who would refuse to lend 100 sesterces to a stranger, but would grant without hesitation an hour, a morning, a day, a year to any request that carried the appearance of social obligation, that person is, by Seneca's measure, engaged in a form of impoverishment more serious than any financial reversal. Money can be recovered. A sum lost to a bad investment or an unlucky season might be rebuilt across years of careful work. Time cannot be returned. The hours given to hollow pursuits are simply gone, and the ledger by which Seneca judged a life rich or poor was not the census official's record of property qualifications, but the quieter interior accounting of how many hours had been genuinely inhabited, genuinely attended to, genuinely one's own. He was not writing this as a man who had always lived accordingly. The letters contain enough honest acknowledgment of his own failures to make the philosophy feel like something earned rather than merely proclaimed. He had spent years in Nero's court. He had given enormous amounts of his attention to the management of an imperial relationship that required constant vigilance, constant negotiation, the kind of sustained political attention that leaves almost no part of the mind genuinely free. He had acquired wealth and influence and had spent decades within the structures that produced both. The philosophy of temporal poverty was not a retrospective condemnation of all of that. He seemed to regard some of it as genuinely necessary, genuinely useful, but the letters carry the quality of a man who is now, in the time that remains, making a deliberate choice about where the attention goes, what the hours are given to, which of the remaining days are genuinely his own. This is what makes the late letters feel different from the earlier essays, not more polished or more philosophically rigorous, but more inhabited. The arguments in De Vita Beata, written at the height of his wealth and influence, have the quality of a carefully constructed defense, a philosophical position held firmly, but held in some sense from the outside. The letters to Lucilius have the quality of a man who has brought the philosophy inside and is living in it now, testing it daily against the actual texture of his experience, finding where it holds and where it requires more work, returning to the same questions with the patience of someone who has finally stopped treating them as problems to be solved and has begun to treat them as companions. The question of whether wealth and wisdom can genuinely coexist, the question at the heart of Seneca's public life and private philosophy, does not resolve itself cleanly in the letters. It does not arrive at a simple answer, a logical proof, a formula that settles the matter. What it does arrive at, across hundreds of pages of sustained, honest attention, is something more like an understanding of the terms of the question itself. The problem is not wealth. The problem is not poverty. The problem is the animus, the inner life, and its relationship to whatever fortune places in its vicinity. A mind that has been brought to genuine steadiness, that has practiced the imagining of less until less is genuinely acceptable, for that has organized its attention around the things that cannot be confiscated rather than the things that can. That mind can inhabit wealth without being destabilized by it, and can imagine the loss of wealth without being destroyed by it. A mind that has done none of this work will be disturbed by both. The question is whether the work can actually be done, whether any real mind, inhabiting a real life, surrounded by the actual pressures of social expectation and financial necessity, and human desire can perform the cultivation that Seneca describes with the completeness he describes it. He was honest about this. He never claimed to have arrived at the end of the practice himself. He named himself a prokopton, a person making progress, not a sage, not a man who had achieved the inner freedom he was writing toward, but a man who was genuinely, sincerely, and without complacency moving in its direction. The category of the prokopton is more interesting than it might initially appear. It is not a consolation for failure. It is not a philosophical excuse for the gap between what one professes and what one lives. It is a precise description of a position that the Stoics considered philosophically serious. Not the position of someone who has arrived, but the position of someone who is genuinely moving, who knows the direction and follows it honestly through terrain that is difficult, who has not mistaken the map for the territory or the theory for the practice. The prokopton's progress is real progress, even if the destination has not been reached. The lamp is lit, the direction is known, the walking continues. There is another dimension of Seneca's account of wealth that the letters develop with particular care, and it opens inward from the individual toward the social, toward what a person with resources owes to the people around them, toward the philosophical question of what generosity is and why it matters. In De Beneficiis, he had developed this at length, working through the philosophy of the gift relationship with the same precision he brought to everything else. Genuine generosity, giving freely, without calculation, for to the right person, at the right moment, for the right reasons, was for Seneca among the highest expressions of virtue, and one of the most defensible philosophical reasons for a person of good character to possess material resources rather than divesting themselves of everything. This is a quietly radical claim. The Cynics had argued that virtue required the elimination of material dependence, the reduction of one's needs to an irreducible minimum, the refusal of the social world's entanglements. For Seneca's response was not to deny the appeal of that position. He acknowledged Diogenes with genuine respect, but to point at what it required the philosopher to give up, the full range of civic and social engagement, the capacity for friendship conducted in the material world, the ability to help. A philosopher who has genuinely divested everything cannot build a school, cannot feed a student, cannot travel to a friend's side in difficulty, cannot give without reserving nothing. The freedom from material attachment that the Cynic achieved was real, but it came at the cost of a kind of presence in the world that Seneca thought the virtuous life required. Wealth, in this account, is justified partly by its uses, not as an end in itself, not as a measure of achievement or a confirmation of worth, but as a condition that makes certain kinds of engagement, certain kinds of generosity, certain qualities of presence in the lives of others genuinely possible. The hand that is open in giving is a hand that holds something worth giving. The virtue is not in the holding. The virtue is in the opening of the hand, in the quality of attention with which the gift is made, in the genuine relationship between giver and receiver that a true beneficium establishes and sustains. But Seneca was careful enough to see the danger in this argument too. It is easy to use the philosophy of generous purposes to justify accumulation that has long since left generosity behind. A person can begin with the honest intention of acquiring enough to give freely, and find at some later point that the acquiring has become its own momentum, its own appetite, that the generosity has become a performance, and the accumulation has become the actual center of the enterprise. The line between holding resources in order to use them well and holding them because one cannot stop, this line is not always visible, does not announce itself, and the person most likely to have crossed it without noticing is the one who has the most philosophical vocabulary available for explaining why the crossing was justified. This is the edge where Seneca's philosophy sits with the greatest honesty, not in the smooth arguments of De Vita Beata, not in the careful technical distinctions between preferred indifference and genuine goods, but here in the acknowledgement that the philosophy can be co-opted by the very appetites it was designed to govern, that the same arguments that allow a wise man to hold wealth without being possessed by it can be used, with almost no adjustment, to permit a merely clever man to hold wealth and call it wisdom. He wrote about this too. In De Tranquilitate Animi, the essay on peace of mind, he described what he called the restless movement that characterizes a life organized around acquisition rather than sufficiency, new estates, renovations, travel, more properties, the accumulation of possessions that do not satisfy, each one followed quickly by the need for another, the movement forward constant, and the actual arrival never occurring. He had seen this in others. He was honest enough to see it at moments in himself. The philosophical diagnosis was clear. This restlessness is not genuine seeking, but flight, the perpetual motion of a mind that is trying to outrun an inner emptiness through external addition, and that will continue running for as long as it mistakes the emptiness for a problem that another property can solve. The remedy Seneca offered was constantia, steadfastness, a stable inner orientation, the quality of a mind that can engage fully with the material world without being swept along by its currents, that can acquire and hold and use and release without any of these acts determining the temperature of the inner room. Constantia is not detachment. It is not the removal of interest or care. A person of genuine constantia can be interested in their work, their friendships, their material circumstances, their city, their world. What they do not do is allow any of these interests to become a governing anxiety, a condition for their well-being, an attachment so total that its disturbance destroys the center. In the final letters to Lucilius, this idea takes on a particular coloring that has to do with time. Seneca, writing in the knowledge that the years remaining are few, describes an orientation toward each day that has something almost devotional in it, not in any religious sense, but in the sense of a sustained commitment of attention, a deliberate inhabitation of the present moment as the only place where the work of philosophy can actually be done. The past is fixed, the future is uncertain, the day that is actually here, the letter being written, the thought being examined, the friendship being sustained across the distance between Rome and Sicily through careful words on a tablet. This is what can be attended to. This is where the work is. The man who is perpetually preparing for the future good life, perpetually accumulating the conditions under which the real living will eventually begin, perpetually deferring the actual inhabitation of the present in favor of some better resourced later moment. That man is, in Seneca's account, impoverishing himself with greater thoroughness than any financial misfortune could. The impoverishment is not visible in the census records. The numbers beside his name go up steadily. What goes down without registering anywhere is the actual inhabited life, the hours genuinely experienced, the days actually lived in, the relationships fully present to, the slow and ordinary accumulation of real time that constitutes the only wealth no external authority can take. A lamp in a late Roman room, the flame small, continuous, casting its circle of warm light on a tablet covered in close, quick writing. Outside the room, it is dark, the kind of darkness that existed before electric light altered the night permanently, the kind in which stars were genuinely visible and the surrounding world genuinely quiet. The letters were written by lamplight, composed in this circle of warmth, surrounded by that darkness, sent to a friend too far away to visit easily but close enough, through the medium of careful words, to actually reach. What Seneca was reaching toward in these final letters was not a solution to the question of wealth and wisdom. He had been around the question too many times to believe it resolved cleanly. The question is too deep for clean resolution. It runs all the way down to the problem of what the self actually is, what it requires, whether the inner life can be genuinely free of what surrounds it, or whether freedom is always partial, always achieved incompletely, always a matter of degree rather than kind. These are the questions the letters open toward and leave open, because any answer that closed them entirely would be a false answer, a philosophical reassurance purchased at the cost of honesty. What settles instead of an answer is something more like a posture. The posture of a person who takes the question seriously enough to keep working on it, who does not use the difficulty of the question as an excuse for abandoning the practice, who returns each morning to the examination of the inner life with the same patient attention, who measures their life not by what the census records, but by the quality of attention they have brought to the hours actually given. The posture of the procoptone, moving, genuinely, in a known direction through the uncertain terrain of an actual life. There is a quality of steadiness in the late letters that is different from the steadiness of philosophical argument. An argument can be steady through the force of its logic, through the precision of its terms, through the care with which each step follows from the last.